welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Katherine Butler Schofield, who is a professor of South Asian music and history at King's College London. She's the author of the recent book Music and Musicians in Late Mughal India, Histories of the Ephemeral 1748 to 1858. And she also hosted a podcast series called The Histories of the Ephemeral on the same theme. We talked about the history of classical music in India, from Nāṭyaśāstra to Dhrupad and to khayals and qawallis. About Aurangzeb's relationship with music, the sacking of Delhi and its influence on Hindustani classical, powerful tawaifs of that time, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Hi, Katherine. Welcome to the show. I am just so delighted that you're here with us.
Hi, Shruti. It is fantastic to be here, and I think I'm equally excited.
So today I want to talk to you about your book, Music and Musicians in Late Mughal India. This is just one of the loveliest books I've read in recent times. It looks like this fat, clunky university press hardback, but you open it and it's just so musical and so beautifully written, and you just give us a slice of a time that is very hard to find normally, and we can get into all of that. But before we talk about the Mughal period, the period that you're talking about is sort of between the Battle of Plassey and the Mutiny. And before you walk us through the decline of the Mughals and Hindustani classical music during that time, can you tell us a little bit about Hindustani classical music before that period, which you've also written about, in your other work? So maybe start us out with, Khusrau or Tansen or, feel free to go quite far back so that we just know what we're dealing with.
Sure, and thank you for that fantastic introduction. So if we're going to go right back, we really need to go back to the Nāṭyaśāstra, to the Sanskrit tradition of writing about music, because it's not that well known that there is a long continuous tradition of writing about music in India, both in North and South, dating back at least 2 millennia, approximately 2 millennia, to the very first of these treatises, the Nāṭyaśāstra, which is not just about music. And of course, the word Sangeet doesn't just mean music, or didn't mean just music then. It includes music, dance, and drama. And it's really about all the performing arts and how they should be performed. And it sets the basis for the melodic entities that become known as rags, but they didn't have that name yet. And it sets the aesthetic principles behind what become North Indian and South Indian classical music much later, which is this idea of the ras, the juice or the essence of affect, of emotion. So music and dance and drama are all about moving the emotions. And the way performers do this is that they distill many kind of transient emotions called bhav into these 9 emotional essences that are then tasted by the listener or the viewer, who becomes known as the rasika, the one who tastes the ras. And this becomes the foundational principles for the next 2,000 years of writing about music. It's still there. There's this fantastic book recently about Bollywood called A Bollywood State of Mind, written by a fantastic person called Sunny Singh here in the UK. And she actually takes ras theory and applies it to Hindi film today in the most beautiful, convincing way. So this idea that between listener and performer, we taste this thing that moves us. That's just fundamental and has been for 2,000 years. So, but it didn't look anything like it does today. So some listeners will probably know the instrument, the veena, and you might know the Saraswati veena in South India. You might know the Rudra veena or the bean in North India. So stick zither with these big pumpkins or gourds. Back in the Nāṭyaśāstra time, veena didn't mean this.
Yeah.
It was a harp. So even the veena was a completely different thing in the Nāṭyaśāstra to what it is today.
Yeah.
So the period where what we now know as Hindustani music, begins to coalesce really in the 16th century, and really starting with the idea that you have these entities called rags, that there are 6 male rags, each of them with these 5 wives called raganis, and they have this special affective essence built into their notes and the patterns of notes and the sound marks that those notes create that also correspond with these beautiful painted icons of ragas and raganis as heroes and heroines and yoginis and nayaks and nayakas and so on. This begins to we begin to get a split between the North and the South in about 1550 when Ramamatya writes about the scales of the South Indian rags. And so they begin to drift apart. And so we get into the Mughal period. And you mentioned Amir Khusro. So Amir Khusro, one of the most important figures in North Indian classical music history, his really important intervention was to systematize what becomes known as qawwali, the arts of the qawwals of Delhi, right? The ones who are at the shrine of Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia. And Mughals, they're kind of Johnny come lately into this scene. They don't appear until 1526. And Babur is only there for 5 years before he dies. And then Humayun spends most of his reign in exile in Iran. Yeah. So it's really with Akbar that Akbar begins to really patronize these local musicians who are singing songs in rag and tal and playing instruments like the Rudravina, the Indian rabab, which has really kind of almost died out now, but it's this really big, fat, round instrument that you see in paintings. With
bass tones that just linger on for a long time. There's nothing else quite like it.
Yeah, it is really amazing. It's a little bit like a surbaha, but even kind of bigger and boomier. Yeah. And of course, sarangi and pakavij and dholak. And it's actually even later. It's in the 18th century that the sitar and tabla appear.
Yeah, and they appear in your story, right? I mean, this is part of the story on how what we now consider as the classical instruments are actually very late.
Yeah, absolutely. But actually, by the time you get to the period I'm talking about, the 18th century, you have all the rags, you have all the tals. They're not quite the same in the 16th and 17th century as they are by the end of the 18th century. That's when they really kind of formulate with what we know today. But you have Dhrupad, you have khayal, you have tapa, you have the sung ghazal, sung in Persian, and then increasingly in this language that becomes known as Urdu. And by the end of the 17th century, you have the great-great-grandson of the great Tansen of Gwalior, a man called Rasbaras Khan, who says, the way these rags and raganis are related to each other doesn't make sense. I'm going to make up my own, sort of musical connections. And this is my raganis system. And he says, the 92 tals, they don't make any sense. Nobody plays the 92 tals. Here are the 11 that are actually in current practice. And he says, nobody understands what the syllables of Tarana mean. This is what they mean. And he gives these Sufi understandings of the syllables of Nom Tom Alap for the first time in the 17th century. And after that, in the early 18th century, we get the sitar and the tabla. Early 19th century, we get the sarod. Yeah. Sarangi continues. Rudravina continues, but it's actually really after 1857 that it kind of disappears because it is the instrument associated with the Mughal musicians, and they refuse to teach it to people who are not members of the family.
So I want to get into all the delicious stories in the book, including, Tansen's grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson, all of those things. But before that, can you talk to us a little bit about the raga style and the Persian influences that started coming in? So the Cliff Notes version that I understand is the Sanskritized idea of the raga is very sonic and very much about the ras, which is what you were describing. But the Persian influences started coming in, and it almost becomes this fantastical, metaphysical thing, right? Like the raga is now its own thing, which may be quite different from what was on paper or what it is sonically or methodically. How does this come about, and why does it still persist in what's going on today?
Yeah, this is super complicated, of course. And it's complicated by the fact that when we say Persian, we're actually referring to the language.
Yeah.
And what we forget is that India was part of the Persianate world. Persian was spoken and used extremely widely in India from about 1000 of the Common Era or Christian era right through until 1837, when it was still the official language of the East India Company. They only replaced it with English in 1837, and there are still people who read Persian throughout the Indian subcontinent, nowhere near as many as used to. And so Persian was this enormous lingua franca that kind of crossed from what is now Xinjiang in China all the way across to Turkey, where it was extremely important at the Ottoman court, right down into the south of India. So the Nawabs of Arcot and of the Marathas in Tanjavur were kind of conversant in Persian. So, it's a language rather than it being necessarily what we're talking about being Iranian culture or even the maqams. So there's a whole set of melodic modes belonging to Western Central Asia, or what we now, think about as Iran and the stans and so on, called maqam. And it's also the word that's used for Arabic, classical maqam, and also Turkish. And there's an amazing section in one 17th century Persian language music treatise on Hindustani music, Tuhfat al-Hind, chapter 5, where it sets out all the Persian maqams that this author knew about that were being used in India. And he uses the word ajam, which means that he's actually talking about the ones coming from Iran. So we do know that, a little bit about that. But basically what happens is you get, like everywhere, musicians love novelty. And you've got these galawans sitting around playing the rabab. And they've got this guy there who's just arrived from Herat in Afghanistan or from Mashhad in Iran, rather. And we know these people were there because they're in the Aini Akbari. Abul Fazl writes about them being present at Akbar's court. And they're hanging around and they're kind of jamming together. And one of them goes, there's this really cool maqam that's got a 3/4 tone re, right? Second scale degree. And this is what it sounds like. And this then enters the record as something that some of these Persian writers were called ghazal.
Yeah.
Part, as in ghazal scale.
Yeah.
So you can play maqams on the bean. Oh. You can play rag on the Persian tambur. And so you get this mixing, and it's about what people like. So there are rags like Zilaf, for example, and Hamir and Hijaji, which actually come from the maqams. So Hijaji is Hijaz maqam, but completely modified into Hindustani style and used to sing Dhrupad to Krishna or whatever.
Yeah.
And you get tals as well. So surfakhta, which is really common among the qawwals, it comes from usul fakhta, which is the Persian usul or rhythmic cycle, fakhta. And it's the same, but again, used to perform Hindustani music. So you get this incredible mixing there on a kind of a practical basis. In terms of ideology, I think what you have is this mixing. I've taught in previous work. So there's a book called Tellings and Texts, which I co-edited with a beautiful colleague of mine, Francesca Rossini, who's professor of Hindi and Urdu. My piece is called Learning to Taste the Emotions, the Mughal Rasika. And the question I asked there, what did it mean for somebody coming who was not originally born in India, necessarily?
Yeah.
What does it mean for them to actually really understand what it feels like, what it should feel like to listen to Rag Dhanashri or Kedar, which have these very specific emotional affects, right? And I came up with this idea of affinity. So there's this kind of experiential common ground between performers and listeners of Rag and performers and listeners of Maqam, which centers on the idea of, in Persian, ishq, and in Sanskrit, shringara.
Shringaras.
Right? And in fact, the late Harold Powers, who was an expert on Rag and Ragamala, used to say, actually, the Ragas and Raganis, they're really all about one ras. They're all different aspects of Shringara. And we can see this too with things like the Nayakabhed, this idea that you have this catalogue of heroines in poetry. And of course, there's Ragamala poetry as well, which is incredibly beautiful in Sanskrit and Brajbhasha.
Yeah.
And you describe a particular heroine in a particular moment of Shringar. You know, is this love in separation? Is this love in union?
Yeah.
Is this the moment when the lover comes? Is this the moment, like in Rag Lalit, where they've had a night of passion, he's sneaking out of the bed to go back to his, other wife, right?
Yeah. So they're all shades, but we call it Viraharas, or we call it Ras, or we call it Shringaras, and so on.
Yeah. So there's this emotional common ground there, and I think that's a big part of it. But I think also there's another thing going on, which is that the idea that Rags and Raganis have power and that they have specific types of affective power is rooted in the 15th and 16th century locally in Shaivism and in Tantra. So if you go further south to the Deccan, you find these paintings and these descriptions of Rags and Raganis that are extremely tantric. And if you look at paintings of Raga Savari, so if you look at one from the 18th century, yes, she will be, enticing snakes, but she may also have some other, animals at her feet or so. And she may have a top and she may be very beautiful, but in paintings from the Deccan, she is a yogini and she is floating and she's got these huge cobras and red vermilion background and dreadlocks, and she is absolutely a powerful divine tantric being. And so I think what you get with the coming of the Mughals is you get the transformation of these ideas of power into something that's much more about worldly power and beautiful clothes and extremely expensive pearls and, and extremely refined painting. For both Rajput and Mughal painting, you get a great refinement, and it dilutes the actual genuine power to move. And
but this is this is not surprising, right? Like in every kind of society where there is a sort of churning of power or there's a new sort of, elite in town, they will appropriate some of the high culture and merge it with whatever they consider the high status, high culture of their own.
Yeah.
And this seems to be, how much of it is about hallucinogens and intoxicants? Like, were they all just drunk, imagining these rags to take some other kind of bodily, almost human form? Or was that not, or am I overreading it?
Well, there are some actually great books about intoxicants in the Rajput and Mughal world because, of course, wine was readily available and used as a means of approaching the divine beloved. The poetry, the Persian poetry that's all about wine is not just metaphorical, right?
Yeah. They were consuming a lot of it.
And of course, everybody was consuming bhang, hashish, etc. Opium, Jahangir notoriously addicted to it. This was a problem. It was regarded as a problem. You shouldn't be giving away all your worldly power to drugs or to women or indeed to music. You need to have control over these things. Otherwise, you're not a worthy prince. And basically, you should have your kingdom stripped from you if you spend too much time doing these things. But nonetheless, that is there. But there's a question. Do we really, if you're a real music lover, do you actually need any of these things to go into an ecstatic state just by listening?
No, you're absolutely right. It's just a question of the people who are writing about it. It's like, what are they smoking?
Oh, it's wild.
So I want to pick up on something you said at the end, which is you shouldn't be, engaging in, addicted to opium and, sort of drowning in music, and, you should have your princely power stripped away from you. And this is a pretty controversial thing in India even today, right? And the central figure there is Aurangzeb.
Yeah.
So the first question is, did Aurangzeb just sort of, kill all the arts and the music of that time? And there are multiple versions of this. One is absolutely he did. And the second, in fact, his name is now a metaphor for someone who sort of snubs the arts.
Yeah.
The other version is that, no, he was actually quite the music lover and, patronized a lot of these musicians and poets in his court. But it was much later in his life that he sort of changed and had a very different religious and spiritual experience, and also a different relationship with power. So what is going on with Aurangzeb? And maybe now we can talk a little bit more about all these folks in the court and who's singing and what's going on, and Kushal Khan and all of those fun characters in your book.
Yeah. Well, I need to preface this by saying that what I'm about to say does not mean that Aurangzeb was a good person, right? In fact, my view is that they were all awful. In comparison to modern understandings of what makes a good ruler, all rulers,
or even a good person, they all kill their brothers and things like that. Like, these are not pleasant people.
These are not pleasant people. These are not right. Okay, so but it is actually the latter. So the sources are really, really clear on this. And actually, even if you just look at how the modern day Quranas talk about their ancestry. So they all trace their ancestors, father and son, back to the court of Akbar and to Tansen. And in an orally transmitted tradition, if you kill music entirely for 50 years, that's not possible. It's not possible to have an unbroken transmission. So I actually, sort of went into this for my PhD with an open mind, thinking about, okay, so what did happen? And it turns out that it's really clear from all of the sources that music continued without any hindrance. So Aurangzeb himself was a great music lover. He married no fewer than 3 courtesans, Tawaif. They weren't called Tawaif at the time, one of whom, Udapuri Bai, became the darling of his old age, one of whom, of course, Hirabai Zainabadi, had an incredibly important and influential role in his decision, the year he turned 50, to turn his ears and eyes away from worldly things. So he loved music. He was extremely knowledgeable about it. There were several treatises in Persian written to him and dedicated to him throughout his reign, the last one being by Tansen's great-great-grandson, Rasbaras Khan, in 1697. So, and he died 10 years later. So it's, it's really late. But the solar year that a man turned 50 in Mughal India was the year that they believed was the threshold of old age, which I just passed, by the way. So I'm now on the threshold of old age. And what do you do if you are somebody who cares about their legacy and somebody who cares about what they're going to say to the Almighty if they're a Muslim or about their reincarnation? What do you do when you are facing old age? You get your worldly affairs in order. You stop doing the things that are distracting you from your worldly duty and your piety. If you are an alcoholic, you give up alcohol. So what he does is he gives up listening. It's a really complicated thing, not to singing. So he continues to listen to recitation, right? And commends to his sons listening to qawallis in the evening. But he stops listening to music that's accompanied by instruments. And of course, this then has a knock-on effect because he decides to stop doing all sorts of things. And he's the emperor. So he is the arbiter of what everybody else is supposed to do.
Yeah.
And so this becomes a big deal that he's given up music. But all that actually happens is that cultural arbitration, the person who is the kind of main patron, becomes his son, Muhammad Azam Shah, who is famous as a khayal singer. And he also hosted in his atelier a young Sadarang who becomes the greatest Dhrupad singer and khayal composer of the 18th century. So he got his start with Muhammad Azam Shah, the royal prince, in the late 17th century under Aurangzeb during the time when he supposedly banned music. So he didn't ban it. He stopped listening to it himself, which had a really important kind of ideological impression, but didn't have the kind of effect that you would, if it were, I don't know, the North Korean dictator saying there will be no more music, then there would be no more music, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't that. It was, I personally am addicted to music. I love music so much that it's such a distraction, I'm giving it up.
So, I think I completely understand your point about how now this is changing the relative status of how music is heard and experienced, not just in his court, but also all his courtiers, right? Because they're the patrons of all these musicians. But the way I interpreted what's in your book is the patronage didn't end. It was just the audience sort of changed, but it's not like they were suddenly out of a home.
No.
And in fact, the role also changed. So, when I read modern day commentary on the great, musicians and dancers of that time, we read a lot about the tawaifs and the courtesan and how they exerted this very important sort of power. They were power brokers of their time, through sexual favors and just sort of the way they networked through that particular society. But also the male musicians seem to have been important power brokers.
Yeah.
Because in your book, you talk about how Kushal Khan Gunasamadra actually tips the odds in favor of Aurangzeb over his brother Dara Shikoh. And this is a story I had never heard before.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, isn't it? It's one I actually found in these tazkiras, so these lives of people.
Yeah.
And in this case, tazkiras of musicians, lives of musicians. And nobody had ever heard this story before. And you know what? I don't even know whether or not it's true, because all I know is that this was something that everybody, a generation later firmly believed about Khushal Khan. So for those of you who've not yet read the book, Khushal Khan was the great-grandson of
Tansen, yeah.
And he was the chief musician to Shah Jahan and hugely feted, but an incredible musician. And he was also, so his son was Ras Baraz Khan, who I've already talked about, who was Aurangzeb's chief musician and also wrote the Shams al-Aswad, the treatise. But he was also the teacher of another major theorist who was a nobleman called Mirza Roshan Zamir, who wrote the most beautiful translation of a Sanskrit work, Ahobala's Sangita Parijata, which is just amazing. Yeah. So, working in this very kind of intellectual milieu, but really quite, he loved money. So so he would get showered in rupees whenever he performed. It is huge sums of money.
Yeah. And
the story goes that in 1653, he saw a way to make quite a bit of money because Shah Jahan had this bet with his commander-in-chief, Amir al-Mulk, about who would become the next emperor after Shah Jahan. And of course, Shah Jahan favoured Dara Shikoh for fairly obvious reasons.
And he had 4 sons.
Yes. And the Mughals did not practice primogeniture, so it could actually have been any of them.
Yeah.
And for a Mughal prince, what you had to do, and this is Munis Farooqi's brilliant book on the Mughal princes that I'm talking about, you had to start building alliances and making friends with all the powerful noblemen and so on. And you had to have really good kind of emotional intelligence. Plus, you had to impress people with your knowledge of both sword and pen. You had to show that you were a really amazing military commander. And Shah Jahan kept Dara at court and didn't really let him display his. He was perfectly fine with the sword, but but he was kept at court and he was pampered.
Yeah,
and he was also really arrogant and rude to all of Shah Jahan's nobles. So they didn't like him very much. This did not set him up well. Whereas Aurangzeb was a real scrapper and Shah Jahan didn't like him, so kept sending him to the Deccan to fight his wars, where he did a very good job of fighting wars. And so he was much better placed to become the emperor in the inevitable war of succession that broke out in 1657.
And went on for about, a year?
It went on for a year.
Yeah.
It went on for a year. And then Aurangzeb killed all his brothers and put Shah Jahan in Agra fort
exactly
for the rest of his life. but didn't kill his father, interestingly. So anyway, the story goes, Shah Jahan has this bet with the commander-in-chief and says, who is going to become the emperor? And the commander-in-chief thinks to himself, it's going to be Aurangzeb, but I can't say that because I'll get my head chopped off by Shah Jahan. So he says, whoever has this particular brilliant revenue officer called Murshid Quli Khan in his retinue will become emperor. So Shah Jahan puts him into Dara Shikoh's entourage, and Murshid Quli Khan is treated really badly by Dara, and so kind of goes back to the commander-in-chief. Anyway, Aurangzeb hears about this guy who's really good with running revenue departments, and he wants him in the Deccan to run things.
Yeah.
And so the commander-in-chief doesn't know what to do and doesn't want to ask Shah Jahan because he will be making his own prophecy come true if he asks Shah Jahan, can you give him to Aurangzeb? So at a drunken party, the chief musician, Khushal Khan, hears about this. He overhears this and he said, oh, by the way, I can fix that for you. If you give me 100,000 rupees, then I'll fix it for you. So what he does is on Nowruz, the Persian New Year, he's standing in his appointed place on the carpet in front of the throne. And he looks at the commander-in-chief and says, okay. And he plays Ragini Tori.
Tori, yeah.
And of course, what Tori does is calms everything down, puts everybody into an ecstatic trance state, like the animals that she's supposed to kind of seduce with her Rudravina and everything. Yeah. And while Shah Jahan is in this trance, Khushal Khan, the musician, indicates now is the time to get him to sign the piece of paper. So he signs the piece of paper, not knowing what he's doing. And the next day, the revenue officer comes up and says, thank you for my release. I'm going to go to Aurangzeb now. Can I have my robe? So, because they had these official robes of release. And Shah Jahan went, what have I done? But he couldn't do anything because he would be admitting that Khushal Khan had so much power over him that he'd made him do something against his will.
Or that he doesn't read his papers.
Or that he doesn't,
which are terrible.
No, both of which are terrible. I mean, the moral for me, the moral of the story is don't sign anything without reading the fine print.
And don't sign anything while listening to really great music. I think that might be part 2.
Yeah, well, if you're off your head on music, don't sign the piece of paper. And of course, what Shah Jahan's done is he's signed his favourite son's death warrant by giving the revenue officer to Aurangzeb. And that's it.
And so what happens to Khushal Khan after that? Because, at some point the jig is up, right? Shah Jahan eventually figures out what happens.
Yeah, so he's completely out of favour. So he's out of favour for the last few years of Shah Jahan's reign. But of course, Aurangzeb, when he comes to the throne, showers him with favours and money and everything else, at least into the 1670s. So there's documented records of him, sort of giving him gifts, for the death of his brother Dhrupad and so on.
Also his son is completely patronized through the court.
Yeah,
who
that's
eventually
right.
writes and, so on.
Yeah, so Rasparas Khan then, after Khushal Khan dies, and we don't know exactly when he dies, becomes chief musician and then writes this treatise where there's this kind of 3 pages of praise to Aurangzeb on the front.
You've set us up in a really nice way because one of the things that starts happening, we think of the decline of the Mughal empire with, Aurangzeb's death in 1707, right? But it takes a while. It's not overnight. And part of it happens through the sacking of Delhi and all the pillage and plunder of first, Nadir Shah and then Abdali. But this is all happening over a period of decades, So somewhere between 1707 and Battle of Plassey, that's 50 years. That's a really long time. The weird thing is, it seems like the courtesans, the musicians, the artists, the poets are doing great during this time.
Yeah.
So what is going on after the decline of Aurangzeb? So is there any truth to the fact that it's actually Aurangzeb's demise which makes it suddenly okay and high status to bring all these musicians back into vogue? Or is it just that was the time? I mean, what is going on?
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's sort of business as usual, really. But do you mind if I read a little bit? Because
I would love for you to read.
Okay, so this is the opening of the first chapter, and this is where I start, and I start in 1753. So this is just before it all goes really horribly wrong. It was the 5th year of Ahmad Shah's reign. Half a decade had passed since the last Mughal emperor to hold any real power, Muhammad Shah Rangile, who died in 1748, had died. Sitting at home in Panipat, north of Delhi, Inayat Khan Rasik had just finished putting the final touches to his latest literary work, a set of musical biographies. It was something entirely new in Hindustan. Given the enthusiastic reception of the first ever biographies of Urdu poets that had just stormed through the Delhi salons, he hoped it would prove popular, for times were uncertain in the Mughal capital. The urbane residents of this cosmopolitan city had shrugged off the 1739 invasion of the Persian Emperor Nadir Shah with sang-froid, his attempted massacre of Delhi's population notwithstanding. The 1730s and 40s burst with new life on the cultural front, with waves of innovation in Urdu poetry, musical composition and painting enrapturing audiences on a daily basis in Delhi's select assemblies. This was the age of the poets Mir Taqi Mir and Mirza Muhammad Rafi Soda, of musicians Niamat Khan Sadarang and Firoz Khan Adarang, of courtesan Nurbai and of Taqi Bhagat, of painters Kalyan Das and Mir Kalan Khan. A golden age looked back upon with bittersweet delight half a century later as the last embers of pre-colonial power sputtered and died. But Nadir Shah's brief incursion had exposed the threadbare nature of the Mughal emperor's new clothes for all to see. By the 1730s, the resurgent Marathas had already diverted the rivers of revenue from central India that had once poured into Mughal coffers. Nadir Shah may have torn away their best of the Mughal treasures, but it was his stripping of Muhammad Shah's dignity that triggered the Mughals' own provincial viceroys in Hyderabad, Awadh and Bengal, likewise to look to their own interests. From 1739, they no longer remitted tax back to the centre. The denizens of Delhi kept calm and largely carried on, at least until Muhammad Shah's death, but it wasn't long before the effects of this disappearing revenue made themselves felt keenly in the pockets, indeed the very bones of Delhi's cultivated elites.
This reminds me, I started reading some of the poetry from that time after I read your book the first time, and it reminds me of Mir Taqi Mir's lines, Dilo Dilli dono agar hain kharab, par kuch luft is ujde ghar mein bhi hai.
Yeah.
Right? Which, how do I translate that? So both my heart and Delhi may be completely in ruins.
Yeah.
But there are still some delight one can take in this ravaged ruination.
Yeah.
Is that a good translation?
It's a beautiful translation. And I've actually written another article about the anxieties of all of these, not of Mir, but also a minor Mughal official who was a musician called Ziauddin, about the devastation of Delhi. Because what happens in this time? So 1753, everything's still basically intact. And then Abdali invades. And then you get the Battle of Panipat in 1761, which actually causes basically everybody who's got any prospects to leave. They don't necessarily all leave. That's one of the points of the book, is that there's still a substantial number of people who stay in Delhi. But anybody who's got any prospects elsewhere goes to Lucknow, Hyderabad, Jaipur, everywhere but Delhi, at least for a period of time. Even Shah Alam II, the emperor, is exiled from Delhi between 1759 and 1772, and he's placed back on the throne by the Marathas, and then is blinded in his own throne room in 1788 by Ghulam Qadir. So it's really, it's a mess.
So here, I mean, I don't mean to take Mir's lines so seriously, but if I pull on that thread, was sort of like the plunder by Nadir Shah and Abdali, in hindsight, one of the best things that happened to Hindustani classical, because what it seems to have done is it's just spread it across North India, right? I mean, it's going now from Delhi to Calcutta, even to Tanjore in the south. I mean, so all of these musicians, they need patrons. And now these patrons, because all the local chieftains, there's the power struggle, and whether it's Lucknow or Oudh or, Calcutta, they all have important zamindars, minor monarchs, even some East India Company officials who are, fluent in Persian and want to sort of have these big darbars and courts of their own. And it seems like all these musicians went to these places and sort of kicked off their own gharanas of sorts.
Yeah.
And assimilated the local influences. And in hindsight, now Hindustani music is so much more diverse, so much more rooted, not in one place, but across a number of places, and so much more syncretic.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's exactly it. I mean, it's two things. And actually, Nadir Shah doesn't seem to be a problem. Nobody really cares about that, which is interesting because we always say, it was Nadir Shah. Actually, it was Ahmad Shah Abdali Durrani, the Afghan warlord.
So Nadir Shah basically is just exposing the weakness, right? That there's really a big problem.
He did, He basically goes, the emperor has no clothes. No clothes.
And takes all the money away. The emperor has no clothes.
And takes the best treasures and so on. But the Marathas had already stopped, sort of that coming back. Rashid Quli Khan, different Rashid Quli Khan.
Yeah, different one,
In Bengal has already stopped sending
stuff back.
The one
who set up Murshidabad after his name. That one.
Exactly. Safdar Jung, of course, who is the Nawab of Awadh, is actually the prime minister. He's the vizier, so he's still there. But Ardamuk sends him away, and he dies in 1752-3. So basically, what happens if we just wind things back a little bit to 1707? There's a series of emperors and weak ones that are kind of puppets for various factions. The great book by Abhishek Kekar on this period, and what happens when you get to Muhammad Shah is all of a sudden you get this kind of 20-year period from 1719 to 48, nearly 30 years, where everything is calm again and all the culture is still pretty much intact. So you get this new golden age. But they're all, of course, looking back and going, wasn't everything wonderful in the 17th century? When everything was really great, which is why they write these biographies of musicians. And then you get the Nadir Shah to Abdali and particularly Abdali invasions, and they all scatter. So what happens is they scatter to places with money and particularly, so sort of take Lucknow and Hyderabad. Mir and Sordar they both go to Lucknow. So do a lot of the best musicians, and courtesans go to Lucknow. A number go to Hyderabad, and they set up shop there, and they start innovating in ways that are attractive to the local Nawabs and Nizams, Rajas, because they want their own stamp on this tradition, but they also want the traditions of Mughal Delhi because they're setting themselves up as the new Mughals. So the Nizams in Hyderabad continued to call themselves Mughals right into the 19th century. But they want this prestige product from Mughal Delhi.
Is this one of the reasons why sort of Dhrupad becomes less relevant and khayal becomes more relevant? Because it's more lyrical and somehow sort of lends itself more to different kinds of interpretations and improvisations in a way that Dhrupad seems very classical.
That's really complicated because actually khayal rises to popularity in the middle of the 17th century, in the 1660s. Okay. So it's actually before all of this. What happens is that Sadarang, who was a Kalawan. So the Kalawans are the hereditary musicians who own Dhrupad, Rudravina, Indian Rabab, and Dhrupad-related genres like Holi, etc. And they only sing that in the 17th century. In the 17th century, the qawwals are the ones who own khayal and tappa and other related genres, and the singing of the ghazal in a classical form. Sadarang learns khayal. And he writes his new style of khayal, and it becomes all the rage.
Oh, nice!
In the middle of the 18th century,
and he's really it. I mean,
And he is it.
The person. I mean, I won't even call him a trendsetter, right? He's almost sort of like the father of the school that emerges for the next 200 years after him.
It's like, there was a kind of big rivalry in the middle of the 20th century between Vilayat Khan Sahib and Ravi Shankar.
Yeah.
So he's like the Ravi Shankar or the Vilayat Khan.
Yeah.
Or like the Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan.
Actually, he's like Baba Alauddin Khan, right? Like the guy who sprouts this entire tree of musicians.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If Baba Alauddin Khan was as famous as Ravi Shankar.
That's true, yeah. Which is a shame that he's not as famous. I think that's people's fault.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Absolutely.
And also recording technology and stuff like that. But yeah, never mind that. Sorry, I sidetracked you.
Yeah. So you've got Siddharang doing this with khayal and teaching the courtesans this particular style of khayal. And what you get in the 18th century with all this movement. So it's important to know that this movement was there before. So you have people moving around. Mirza Natan, general in Shah Jahan's army in the 1630s, goes to Bengal where he's fighting with, in Arakan, which is now, sort of Rohingya in Myanmar, and like a really long way from Delhi. And he takes his Kalawans with him and he uses them as emissaries back to the centre. So musicians travel with their patrons and they travel on their own, and qawwals travel from shrine to shrine and so on. So this always happened. There were always travel routes. But what happens is they're all on the move in this period. And this means that there's all sorts of extremely talented people who were not necessarily originally regarded as elite, but who can make names for themselves and they can pretend to be something that they're not when they reach Murshidabad or whatever.
Yeah.
So you get these troops of courtesans who are unbelievably talented, who travel, and they start out in Punjab or whatever. And by the time they get to Hindustan, they're Kashmiri. Because if they're Kashmiri, they're more beautiful and they're better singers and they have more, etc.
I love that these stereotypes have lasted 250 years.
I know, it's great, isn't it? It's like all the Circassians who are so spectacularly beautiful. But this, therefore, is the century where you get the rise and rise and rise of the sitar, the tabla, and dancers of Tawaif who all have this composition that they use called the gut.
Yeah.
Right? So this is the rise of the gut, and it starts in the early part of the 18th century, and you can trace it through work of people like Alan Miner, Jim Kippen, Margaret Walker, through with dancers, sitar players, and tabla players. And this completely transforms how Tal is written about and thought about in this century, completely. So it's originally based on Sanskrit kind of divisive feet and meters, a little bit like, the meter of an Urdu poem or whatever. It's divisive by the time you get to the 18th century. It's additive in the 17th century. And that's all because of this. It's the rise of the gut. Similarly, you get...
And we're still playing that. That's literally like what all your Kathak players, tabla players, everyone will learn the gut.
And they're learning Masid Khani gut and they're learning Firoz Khani gut from this period. So you get that. You also get things like tapa, which was originally a kind of a form of khayal in Punjabi and part of the qawwals.
Yeah. It's still sung today, at weddings and by women. And the folk is all tapas, right?
It's
even now.
Fantastic.
I love it. And it's very naughty.
Oh, so naughty. And it's wonderful. But you get, it becomes gentrified and it becomes all the rage in Lucknow, because what happened is there's a man called Taj Khan Qawwal, and he is the chief qawwal in Delhi in the 1740s. And an extremely racy travel writer, Dargah Quli Khan, writes all about Khan Qawwal. And his three sons, go to Lucknow, where they set up as the main khayal singers in Lucknow in Asafuddaullah's time. And one of their sons, Ghulam Nabi Shori, becomes famous for completely rewriting tappa. And he does so because he's this kind of charismatic genius, but he also rewrites it in several different languages. It's no longer just in Punjabi. It's now in Kadiboli. It's now in Brajbhasha. It's now in Kashmiri.
Yeah.
It's now in all of these other languages.
Yeah.
And it becomes something that Lucknow can call its own. Yeah. So something similar then happens to Tomri, which starts out in Delhi, as far as we can work out, in the first part of the 19th century. And it's a gentrified folk form.
Yeah.
And then these two Tawaif from Rampur turn up at the court of Wajid Ali Shah. in the 1830s and 40s. And he falls in love with them and he marries them because he married basically everybody with all his muta wives. And Tomri then becomes associated with Vajid Ali Shah. But what's really interesting, and this is from a book called The Scattered Court by Richard David Williams, which is about Hindustani music in Bengal. Fabulous book. He found that Vajid Ali Shah actually kept writing Dhrupads and khayals and all sorts of things. And in fact, his senior wife, Khas Mahal, who went with him to Metiaburj, wrote more Tumris than Vajid Ali Shah did.
Tell me a little bit more about Tumri, because this is one thing where the Tumris that were sung a couple of 100 years ago are still sung today. The ones in Braj Bhasha, I can listen to that stuff today on YouTube and Spotify.
Yeah.
That took place in a concert maybe 20, 25 years ago. What is going on with this incredibly tight continuation of the Tumri in multiple languages? The language somehow doesn't seem to matter, but the style has really, really persisted.
Yeah. So Tumri, the Ang of Tumri, is incredibly influential, in part because it gets associated with Tawaif. And again, the 18th and 19th century is the rise of the Tawaif. And then, of course, the Lucknow Tawaif gets huge buckets of nostalgia kind of poured all over her.
Yeah, they are the Meena Kumari and the Madhubala of their time, right? They are the absolute heroines.
And then they're played by Meena Kumari and Madhubala. Exactly. So
that's true, actually. That's hilarious.
So they're just incredibly important. But the thing about the Tumri and other kinds of genres that are sung in Tumri style within these courtesan lineages, and then by people they train and so on, is that they are very, very emotional in a way that khayal and Dhrupad are not. So with Dhrupad and khayal, what's really, really important is the rag, and it's conveying the emotions of the rag through perfect sonic representation. So with Dhrupad, yes, the song lyrics are also really important in Dhrupad, and they help to kind of convey the meaning of the rag, but it really is fundamentally important. It's about the rag. With khayal, it's also about the rag. The rag is also important. The lyrics are less important, depending on your gharana. But what's really important is the virtuosity with which you sing the rag. With Tomri, the rag is important, but it's less important than the emotional expression of the words. Yeah. And I have recently been studying the ghazal, not in any formal way, with the incredible Tomri singer Vidya Rao. And her teacher was Naina Devi, and Naina Devi's teacher, of course, was Begum Akhtar. So it's this incredible lineage going back to the last great Lucknow courtesan. And I'm really at this point trying to understand how the Urdu ghazal works traditionally as a song form. What does the addition of rag do to poetry? How does it change its meaning or constrain its meaning, etc.? And what's revelatory about Vidya Rao's singing, but also her writing about Tumri and other forms, is her focus on crafting the words of a really simple Tumri or a really complex ghazal. And you sing each of the words to bring out different meanings, and you can bring out all of these song lyrics have multiple meanings, multiple layers of meanings. And when you have a really opaque line, if you just pull out the meaning of the first word, it could be in a different relation to the next word. And so because it's so much about expressing emotion,
lyrically and not just through music,
the emotion of the lyrics as well as through the song, it becomes the basis of popular form. And that's why it's so popular.
So is this sort of like the Tumri is the equivalent of the poetry leaving the court and being recited by fakirs, right? So this also is, I won't exactly say a dilution, but it's just making a very classical form so much more accessible to people who don't know high music and high culture. And then that's what becomes mainstream and takes off. Is that a good way of thinking about it?
Well, it's more complicated than that because it starts out as a folk song.
Yeah.
You know, it starts out, and in Bhojpuri, a lot of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Starts out as folk, and then it becomes classicized, and then it's gentrified, and then it becomes huge. And then with the advent of the recording and recording technology and the first gramophone recordings in 1902, the first people who are singing on those are these very entrepreneurial women we know as Tawaif. They're the ones who embrace gramophone technology. The Dhrupad singers aren't doing it because no way, they're not going to have anything to do with that.
And they have this idea that nothing can quite capture the sound and the spirituality of what's going on and put it in a box, right? There's a different problem going on with the Dhrupad gharanas, and it's not just about not teaching people the rubab or something. It's like what they're doing is like sort of like this divine connection that should not be adulterated in any form, which is so strange.
Absolutely. But to give them their due, they're also right.
Yeah.
Because putting it on record completely transforms it into something else. It makes it a commodity. And we are so used to thinking of music as a commodity. It's actually really hard to think back to a time where you couldn't buy and sell a record. And so, but this means that it's Tomri and ghazal and these forms that are going into middle-class households.
Yeah.
You know, minus the slightly decadent body of the tawaif, which you might not want in your sitting room.
Yeah.
And that is what makes these lighter forms, or what are regarded as lighter forms, but aren't really. They're really difficult.
They're very classical and difficult.
That's what makes them huge. So, yeah.
So I want to talk about two different things. I'll come to the Tawaif in a minute, and you have some great stories in the book. I want to talk a little bit about Punjab for a minute. Punjab seems to be quite different. So I can see a very clear connection of everything from Delhi to all the way to Calcutta, right? And even further south. What transmits from Delhi to Punjab and Lahore seems to be quite different. So one is, of course, the qawwal and the qawwali element. Second is the laikari, which is the rhythm. And the tal seems to be much more important and very different in Punjab and Lahore than what it is in other parts. Is this because of all the Sikh sort of, revolts and what's going on in the politics there? Is it the language? Is it this interesting Sufi culture? Why does rhythm become so important for the qawwals and the Punjabi music in a way that even now, like, when you hear Bade Ghulam Ali Khan or someone, I mean, that style of laikari is just completely different from anything you would hear from people further east.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not sure there is an answer to the why question, or that I have an answer to the why question. But what's really important to note is that it's pretty certain that the tabla originated in Punjab. So the very first painting of tabla that we know of is by Nain Sukh of Guler in the Punjab Hill States, right? There's a couple of beautiful paintings. One is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it's this beautiful painting of a tawaif on horseback following a prince. I can't remember who it is. I think it's from Jasruta, actually. And she's followed by a man who is playing tabla.
Oh, lovely.
On horseback. And so the best person writing about this is Jim Kippen. He writes about the evolution and the emergence of the tabla. It's almost certain that it comes from Punjab. And so you actually have these really strong and different drumming traditions in Punjab coming through there.
Which is interesting because the Punjab gharana is actually a Pakhavaj gharana.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that Punjab is also where the tabla originated.
Yeah, but Pakhavaj also being huge. But the other tal that seems to come from Punjab and then just becomes one of these pan-Indian tals is Kaharawa tal. And Kaharawa tal, which obviously we kind of associate with Bhangra, but we have these fantastic paintings from the late 18th century of Tawaif dancing Kaharawa dressed as men. So what they do is they hoist up, so it's the masculine. They hoist up their skirts, they tie them up with their dupattas like a kamaband, and they put a turban on and they dance as men to Kaharawa tal. And this is coming from Punjab. So there's
fantastic.
But the other thing you need to remember too is that after 1857, Delhi is actually run from Punjab.
Yeah.
So Delhi is so close to Punjab. So there's a huge and the distance to Lahore is not very far. And there were qawwals moving backwards and forwards between Delhi and Lahore all of the time. So there's a lot of connections there. There's a really, really great book by a woman called Radha Kapuria on music in colonial Punjab. It's Oxford University Press. And she writes about the period from Ranjit Singh onwards.
Okay.
But certainly this period, I mean, it's where the innovation's coming from.
Yeah. So now I want to go back to the Tawaif. I mean, you have this fantastic chapter on Khanum Jan and Mrs. Sophia Plowden. And this is, again, honestly, Katherine, some of the stories in this book, we've never heard of these names. We've never heard of these people. I didn't even know that someone like Sophia Plowden existed until I read your book. So she is the wife of an East India Company officer who meets Khanum Jan, who's one of the great Tawaifs. And they seem to strike this incredible relationship. And to our great fortune, Plowden is also a great diary and journal writer and seems to have preserved all of that stuff that you've somehow managed to unearth.
Yeah, I know. Well, I was actually fortunate because musicologists found her tune book back in the early 90s. And it's in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, which is actually where I live. And along with the tune book, there were these loose leaf folios, which has the beautiful little miniature paintings on them. And everybody just said, oh, it's a series of miniature paintings, which might have lyrics on them that might be related to the songs. Anyway, so I thought I'd go and have a look. And lo and behold, through a series of detective work that is described in the book, I identified the lyrics. They are the lyrics to the tunes that are in the tune book.
Yeah.
And have been able to reconstruct about a quarter of the songs and what they would have sounded like maybe to European ears.
Yeah.
The point being, it's actually impossible to get back to the originals by just having the notation and the lyrics. We can have a go, but it will never be what it actually sounded like. It's just too far, and the Europeans made too many mistakes in writing down the tunes. And I think mostly in terms of tal, because they just didn't understand any tals that were anything apart from 3/3 or 4/4.
No, and also Indian music doesn't lend itself well to whatever the piano scale is, right? Like we have these tones and microtones between notes, and that's where all the action is.
Yeah.
So even if they put down the rag in some kind of a basic scale on paper, it's not going to sound anything like what it actually sounds like.
Yeah.
But you've still managed to do something quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, there was a huge amount of fun work that I did. I did it with a harpsichordist called Jane Chapman, and we actually
So let's tell us the whole story about the harpsichord and what's going on. It sounds like crazy historical fiction that I would watch on a Netflix show. So tell us the whole story.
Yeah. So basically, we're at the court of Asaf ad-Dawla in 1788, 1787, 88. And you have this English woman called Sophia Plowden. And I have to remember to get her name right because her descendants are still with us. They still live in London. And her descendant, Geoffrey Plowden, and his daughter, Sophie. And hello, if you're listening. And Geoffrey's well into his 90s now. It is amazing. So Sophia, she was married to an East India Company officer. She was a very, very keen and talented amateur harpsichordist. The other thing that she did during her time in India was have 7 children. So she was constantly...
10. Is it 10 or 7?
She had 10 in total, and she had 7 while she was in India.
Oh, my God.
And she must have been constantly breastfeeding and nursing. And the most remarkable thing, so when I first was reading her journals, it was when I'd actually very recently given birth to my own son. So I was still nursing him, and I was reading her accounts of... all her children came down with measles, and then they all came down with smallpox. And then everybody would come and have their children kind of inoculated from the smallpox variolas. And then 6 o'clock in the morning, brought to bed of my 7th child. And this time I've decided that I'm not going to give the child to the dye. I'm going to nurse him myself. And I'm just reading this and just having so much sympathy with this woman and this precarious situation. And all of her children survived, which is amazing. The rest of her time, she went around collecting the songs of what the British called Nach girls.
Yeah.
So from the Hindi Urdu word nach for dance, and writing them down in her songbook, and then learning them and singing them herself in the original languages, which she didn't understand, sometimes to harpsichord accompaniment, sometimes in kind of masquerade with a little band of Europeans all dressed up as tabla players and sarangi players and things. I mean, it sounds absolutely, to our minds, it sounds absolutely dreadful. It sounds like blackface or something.
Actually, I think
horrific.
It sounds fantastic.
I'm glad you said
that. I want to be friends with her. Like, I want to know what's going on in that household. I want to be a fly on the wall. I want to hang out with this merry band of, I don't know, recreators. It sounds so fabulous.
Mad people. But I think the thing is at the time, I mean, the Shah Alam II, the emperor, actually made her a begum on the strength of, her attempts for this kind of cultural rapprochement. It was actually really regarded as an amazing thing at the time. So she goes to Lucknow with her husband, and which is where she's picked up all her best songs in the past. And she wants to reconnect with Antoine Paulier, the Swiss mercenary. He had a really amazing Nach set, or taifa. And she wanted to reconnect with them to collect more of their songs. And there was this new star diva in town called Khanam Jan, and she just fell in love with Khanam Jan's songs. So she got Khanam Jan to come and sing all of these songs to her and write them down. And there was a Goan Portuguese man there called John Braganza who helped her add a bass line. And so we have all of these songs, including a song that was written by Asaf-ud-Dawla, the Nawab himself, which is in the collection, and we have the tune for that. It is completely mad, but Khanam Jan herself was this extraordinary woman, and we have what I believe is actually a novelized version of her life. So she actually started out, she first appears on the scene in Kanpur, which of course the British called Cawnpore, in the British cantonment as a tawaif, working to entertain the British officers and troops there. And then, of course, Lucknow calls. It's much, much more glamorous, and of course, it's the successor to the Mughals, much more money. And so she moves there. And there's actually a satirical poem in verse written about her departure from Lucknow, which is in a fantastic book by Ian Woodfield called Music of the Raj, where he talks about her departure. And in the book, she dies when she gets to Lucknow because, of course, the courtesan has to have a tragic ending. You can't have a happy ending for a tawaif.
Because otherwise how can Meena Kumari perform her life if she has a happy ending?
Exactly. But actually in real life, she goes on to have this incredibly successful career in Lucknow, amongst, with this kind of mixed environment. So, and if anybody knows that the famous painting, which is now in Tate, Britain, of Colonel Mordaunt's cock match, she went to those cock matches with all of those kind of Europeans and Nawabs and aristocrats and Tawaif. And
so that's the interesting thing, right? All these Nach girls and Tawaifs, they were not stuck in that gendered box that all the other women were stuck in. They could actually go from court, they could go to the races, they could do all of these interesting things, which makes them very fun characters.
Oh, they're great. And what's really amazing is that the Europeans actually recognized that they were not like, they weren't like wives in the zanana, and they also weren't quote-unquote prostitutes. This attitude, of course, changes dramatically by the time you get to the 19th century when the British lump them in with common prostitutes in the most appalling way. But in the 1780s, they're regarded much like opera divas.
Yeah.
So, and really glamorous, really successful. You really want them at your parties, all of this kind of thing. Yeah, they might be mistresses to men, but, that doesn't matter.
But that's allowed too.
That's
and it
allowed.
is respectable in society.
Absolutely.
In fact, in high society.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and completely respectable and respected, and that's fine. She's so much fun to write about, the pair of them.
I love that chapter so much.
Yeah. But there are, of course, two more Tawaif in the book. So one of whom is, of course, the famous Malakabai Chandar in Hyderabad, which is really about her relationship with her ustad, who was one of these Delhi Kalawans in Hyderabad. And that chapter's really about, we've got this amazing collection of this man called Khushal Khan Anup, not to be confused with the previous Khushal Khan.
Yes.
who puts together this incredible album of songs, about 2,000 in day and night rags, which tell us huge amounts actually about what was being performed and at what times and for whom at the court of the Nizam of Hyderabad. But there's also this incredible illustrated Ragamala from the time, which is dedicated to this Maratha general, Raja Rao Rambha, who was the first joint patron of both Malakabai and Khushal Khan. And it's just fascinating. But how do you kind of get sort of social and cultural history out of these quite technical materials? And the other Tawaif, of course, is the great Mayali dancing girl from Jaipur and from Sampur Salt Lake.
Yeah.
And about whom, I mean, we know a lot about what kind of person she was. She was a bhagtan, so a richly auspicious courtesan.
Which is like, the equivalent of devdasis or something like that.
Exactly.
Because that word, we hardly use that word anymore, but I think people are more familiar with devdasis. And at that time, the Sambal Lake was a really important place and just massive amount of trade.
Hugely.
And how it was basically providing salt across the board because salt mining was so disgusting and expensive.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, basically, if you don't know Sampur Salt Lake, it's a lake that lies between Jaipur and Jodhpur, and it was originally held in common by the two states. And one of the things that my research shows through this amazing person is that it was a commons. It was held as Gandhiji also argued that salt is common. It's needed for life on Earth. It should be held in common by everybody, all the plants and animals and human beings that rely on salt to survive. We all have to have salt. We die without it. It's held in common.
But they also had lots of issues, right? The Jodhpur and the Jaipur, like the princes were constantly fighting over the share and the route it would take. And salt was like a meaningful commodity.
It's hugely a meaningful commodity, but it replenishes itself at the Salt Lake because
which is advantage. Yeah.
Which is an advantage. But also, of course, the British recognised it as a money making scheme. So they a little bit later than this period grew a massive salt hedge. 1,000 miles long between them.
Yeah. So do you know Anton Hose? He is a historian who's been on the podcast, and he talked about the salt hedge and the salt mines in Bengal and all the crazy things that happen. Yeah. So I think the listeners are familiar with this crazy story by now.
Yeah. So this is kind of prehistory to the salt hedge, which is basically, so the East India Company essentially operated as a protection racket, like the mafia. And what they would do is they'd take their superior army and plant them on your territory and say, we will offer you military protection if you pay us heavy tribute and help us to quell thuggy, right? Which was banditry, but the British made up this kind of weird ritual tantric murdery thingy with, right? So if anybody's seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and Kali Ma Shakti Day, it's meant to be he's meant to be a thug. So he they did that to Jaipur and Jodhpur and the other Rajput states in 1818.
Yeah.
And by 1835, Jaipur and Jodhpur basically had enough and were not giving their money. And so the East India Company went, right, we're taking your one source of industrial revenue, Sampur Salt Lake, until you pay us back. And the whole story unfolds out of the name of this Bhagtan, Mayali dancing girl. She appears in the margins of an account book from Sampur Salt Lake, written by the superintendent of the lake, and is this kind of weird note which says, she was paid in salt when she was supposed to have her salt stipend taken away from her and she was supposed to be paid in cash. And then 6 months later, he said, we gave cash to Jaipur and Jodhpur, and then Jaipur and Jodhpur paid her in salt. It's like, okay, so how is this woman so powerful? And what does this salt mean if not only she defies the British superintendent of the lake and makes him give her 25 morns, which is about £1,000 of annual salt stipend in salt and not cash, but Jaipur and Jodhpur make sure she gets it. So she's got control there too.
Yeah.
And the whole story kind of unfolds that there's this incredible reliance on the salt, but it's not just about money and it's not just about life. It's actually a gift from the goddess of the lake to the people. And they exist in a relationship of namak halali with the goddess and with the states of Jaipur and Jodhpur. And if you break that salt bond of faithfulness to the salt and become namak harami, then that's horrific. And so this woman, this auspicious woman, I have this hunch that actually when she was performing in her auspicious role at Sampar Salt Lake during all the festivals and things, she kind of became, in some sense, an avatar of the goddess. Herself.
I thought, my sense was, I think it would be her court or her mehfil where all the deals were being brokered.
Oh, I
because
bet.
It's this neutral, important place where no one can really fool around, and she's sort of also a divine presence, so you can't really shed blood and do other terrible things.
Oh, I love that idea, and I bet that's and the thing is we can say anything we like because literally all we know about her.
Let's sell it to Netflix.
I think it would make the best Netflix series. Because, of course, there's this whole kind of the other thing which happens, which is that the young Maharaja is assassinated by Jutaram, who is the prime minister. And then Jutaram tries to assassinate the agent to Rajputana, Major Alves, and murders Martin Blake instead. And Martin Blake is married to Wazir Khanam, who is the mother of Dark Dehlavi. And, of course... her husband is Shamsuddin, who murders William Fraser, the the resident in Delhi. So there's this kind of real moment here in Delhi and Jaipur of rebellion against the British and trying to assassinate. Anyway, the British get back on top of that. But then there's this series of strikes by I think they're Bauri, actually, kind of well builders and dam builders and so on at Sampar, because Lieutenant Robert Morrison, the last superintendent of the lake, is a horrific person. He's I'm perhaps not allowed to swear, but I would prefer to call him an extremely rude name on this podcast.
You can swear.
He was an asshole.
We'll keep it. We might have to beep a part of it, but we'll keep most of it.
So he was so severe and horrendous to Indian people. He hated India, and he was part Indian himself, hated them so much that in 1857, in the middle of the mutiny, Sir Henry Lawrence sacked him as agent to Bharatpur because he was so awful to the locals. So imagine how bad you would have to be sacked in the middle of the mutiny. So anyway, he's the last superintendent of Jaipur, of Sampar Lake, and they all go on strike against him. And then he has to kind of row it back. So, it's just this extraordinary series of things that are just kind of revealed by the name of this one really important woman in the margins of an account.
No, I really love it because I love learning about these people that we really don't know that much about. But the other part of it is, I think we always think of music and poetry and culture as entertainment, which is kind of happening on the sidelines, Nach girls and Tawaif. But I think we just forget how much it is part of the fabric of everyone's day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
Whether it is the qawallis, whether it is the fakirs, whether it is the Nach girls, whether it is, the high priests of Dhrupad, they're all incredibly important, multifaceted people sort of walking in and out of court and hanging out with the regular people and informing how something is written and how you can tell truth to the king, but in the form of poetry or song, but you can't quite say it directly.
Yeah.
So this is the stuff that is just so delicious in your book and all your other work. So thank you so much for doing this. This was such a pleasure.
Oh, I'm so glad you enjoyed it. And I wrote it so that people would read it and enjoy it.
Yeah, strongly recommend everyone reads this and all your other work. It's very, very readable. And thank you, Katherine, for doing this. This was really such a joy to finally get to chat with you.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and @Ideas of India. Also, check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.